Good evening, everybody. So I became interested in sex by reading the history of science. Isn't that how it usually happens? We seem pretty certain today that human beings exist in two groups, in two categories, boys and girls. But this wasn't always the case that we believed this, and my prediction is that it won't always be the case in the future. For about 2,200 years, from the ancient world until about 1700, people believed in what's become known as the one-sex model. That doesn't mean that they didn't think there were differences between men and women. They structured their society around their beliefs about those differences. But they did think that there was only one healthy, ideal human form, and that human form was male. Sometimes, however, there wasn't enough heat in the womb during gestation, and because of that, the fetus was stunted. And when it came out as a child, it would always be a little bit smaller, a little bit weaker, a little bit less intelligent, a little bit less rational, a little bit less moral, and on top of all that, her reproductive organs would also be inside out. Being female was considered basically a birth defect, but there was one set of human organs. It was just a question of where they were, whether you were a man or a woman. There was a radical shift in this view over the course of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. People started thinking that men and women were not only different, but radically different. They were opposite. This is where the very strange term opposite sexes comes from. The idea was that what men were good at, women were bad at, and vice versa, and that you needed to bring the two together in order to have a complete set of human traits that they complemented each other. The differences in sexes that the Victorians considered important can be seen if you look at anatomical images of skeletons. So, for one thing, the man's chest is very large. It's very large because men have to exert themselves, they have to breathe heavily. And of course, the woman's pelvis is very big because she has to give birth. Guess whose head is bigger? By the time these images came out, people had known, anatomists had known for about 30 or 40 years, that actually women's cranial capacity to body size ratio is larger than that of men's. But they thought that these images were more instructive because they pointed out something important, even if they weren't representative. And you can see here why that pelvis had to be so big. It was for this ghoulishly huge head. The changes from one-sex to two-sex model came along with huge changes in the economic and cultural environment in Europe. During the time when people believed in one sex, most people were peasants. Most people worked in the fields, and they worked in the fields as family units. The man of the house was in charge of that family unit, but childcare occurred in the fields, right? There wasn't some strict division of labor going on. During the Industrial Revolution, labor moved outside the house. It became wage labor. And the two sexes, the idea of two completely different sexes, facilitated the kind of work that needed to get done in the new economic environment. There were some radical shifts about men and women that came along with the shift in these models. For one thing, some of you may be surprised to learn, but during the Middle Ages and the period before that, because women were thought to be more earthy, more in touch with their bodies, more physical, whereas men were more rational and more in control, women were obviously thought to be the more sexual, more lustful, more interested in sex, thought about sex more often, had more pleasure during sex. Not only Eve, you notice, but also the snake is female. Of course, during the Victorian period, this changed, and women began to be thought of as asexual beings who didn't experience pleasure at all. At the same time, during this period, at one point in London, up to 25% of women were actually diagnosed with hysteria. Hysteria was a very vague female malady that could be cured by going to your doctor, and since there are children in the room, I'll let you guess what the doctor did. Until a handy little device was invented to be used at home. That was, the reasoning for that was that women needed this kind of release for physiological reasons, but they didn't experience any pleasure to go along with it. They just made all those doctor's appointments for no particularly good reason. With the exception of this strange doctor's story, the idea of complementary sexes, of women as nurturing and men as competitive, has survived as our view of how the traditional family works. And even though a lot of people say that they're moving away from it, if you think about how we actually divide up labor as opposed to what we say, we still actually believe in these kinds of complementary roles. But things are starting to change, and they're starting to change. You can see how they're changing if you think about new attitudes towards intersexuality, homosexuality, transsexuality, among other things. These titles are all about intersexuality, which shows that it is becoming more widely discussed in the public, but not very much is known about it, I think, nonetheless, publicly. So what does it mean, intersexuality? Well, biologist at Brown, Ann Fasto-Sterling, has estimated that about 1.7% of the population actually falls into a category where chromosomal sex doesn't line up neatly with phenotype, that is, either with external appearance or with internal organs, although many of these people don't know that they're in this category. It comes up in the news most frequently with regard to female athletes. The Olympics actually required mandatory sex testing in order to participate in the female games from 1968 to about 1999. And those tests were first visual and then chromosomal. The last time they happened in Atlanta, 8 women actually failed the chromosomal tests, although they were allowed to compete as women. Now people are tested only if a suspicion is raised about their sex. Most recently, Caster Semenya, a South African runner who won a world championship, and she was asked to be evaluated by a panel that consisted of a gynecologist, an endocrinologist, a psychologist, an internal medical specialist, and a gender expert in order to determine whether she could continue competing as a woman. It was decided that she could, but I run off that list in order to show that we have started to come to terms with the fact that there is no biological definition of sex. We construct these ideas. Where you don't see intersex in the media is when it comes to pediatrics and infant care. But there are still standards of care out there that say you should intervene surgically if necessary to make sure that the person fits the model, rather than reconstructing our models to fit people.